On that day in April 1968, the day after Dr. King was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel, I remember being in my 6th grade class. Why I remember it was a Friday, I do not know. Our teacher, Mr. Beck, must have been discussing with us the events of the previous evening, and a classmate turned to the entire class and said, "I hate that N word." I don't know that I'd ever heard the word before. Maybe, I just couldn't remember. The look on her face was one of hatred, complete with curled lips. I remember thinking at the time, we're 12. What on earth could he have done to you that could make you so mad? It took me a few years longer to figure out that some folks are raised to hate from a very young age, like that song from South Pacific, "You've got to be carefully taught." Those of us my age and older may remember where we were when we heard of Reverend Dr. King's assassination, or the riots in the days after his passing. His life and words were the central pivot point around the struggle for civil rights in the 1960s. This homily is entitled Dr. King's Final Focus because I'd read in a couple of places how during his last few years of writing and preaching, he'd highlighted the scourge of war and the ongoing sins of imperialism and materialism that were and are feeding ongoing poverty and economic inequality. However, in reviewing his writings, particularly in Cornel West's edited book, The Radical King, and for those of you who've not heard Cornel West, whether you agree with him or have challenges with the way he sees the world, he's going to raise your blood pressure. It's not a bad thing. Blood flow is good. But I've discovered threads of a larger tapestry of written material from Dr. King, exploring his deep concerns over global conflicts and neocolonialism, racism, and poverty, and how they feed off of each other. These writings trace their roots back to his days at Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, where he became familiar with the work of Gandhi and his philosophy of nonviolence. Central to any review of Dr. King's life and philosophy is that concept of nonviolent resistance, originating in his Christian theology and the work of a Hindu teacher and holy man, Mohandas K. Gandhi, also known as Mahatma or Great Souled. Gandhi was assassinated in India in 1948. Gandhi's concept of satyagraha, translated as soul force or truth force, was used to sway the efforts of the British colonial government to deny the rights and needs of its country's citizens. After hearing of Gandhi's message and methods during his college and seminary years, and using nonviolent resistance proposals of Bayard Rustin and Reverend Glenn Smiley during the Montgomery bus boycott of 1956, Dr. King traveled to India in 1959 as the guest of Prime Minister Nehru. Here are his words from My Trip to the Land of Gandhi, written upon his return. Nonviolent resistance does call for love, but it is not a sentimental love. It is a very stern love that would organize itself into collective action to right a wrong by taking on itself suffering. While I understand the reasons why oppressed people often turn to violence in their struggle for freedom, it is my firm belief that the crusade for independence and human dignity that is now reaching a climax in Africa will have a more positive effect on the world if it is waged along the lines that were first demonstrated in the continent of Gandhi himself. 2 years earlier, in 1957, well aware that racism knew no geographic boundaries, Dr. King had signed on to the Worldwide Declaration of Conscience along with Eleanor Roosevelt and Bishop James Pike. They were acting together under the auspices of the American Committee on Africa. That Declaration of Conscience proclaimed December 10th, 1957 as Human Rights Day, a day of protest against the inhumanity of the South African government. As an educational aside, Human Rights Day has been recognized every year since December 10th, 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN General Assembly. Point of information, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the most widely translated piece of literature in the world, second only to the Christian Bible. In 1962, Dr. King became a co-sponsor with South African leader Albert Luthali of the Worldwide Appeal for Action Against Apartheid. On his way to Norway to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, King made a number of speeches in England in December of 1964 regarding the need for the release from prison of South African leaders Nelson Mandela and Robert Sobukwe. His legacy of engagement on the subject of sanctions in South Africa continued long after his death, and in 1986, the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act passed our Congress, and the South African government began dismantling the racist structures they'd so painstakingly created during 100 years of oppression. Dr. King spoke to the need for confronting global racism and economic equality constructively to reduce the danger of racially fueled wars and the possible destruction of whole societies. He also understood that war was fueled with the bodies of poor and desperate people. His ideas had evolved from the notion of war as a necessary evil, as in ending the rise of Adolf Hitler, to an understanding that weapons of mass destruction removed the possibility that armed conflict could serve any good at all. Driven by the twin concepts that violence in any form is immoral and impractical of itself, and that war only breeds more war, I think we've finally gotten that message, Dr. King devoted himself to pressing for world peace. He wrote in 1964 that no nation can really win a war if it becomes a world war. It is no longer a choice between violence and nonviolence, but ultimately it will be nonviolence and non-existence. In his speech before the Nation Institute in February 1967, Dr. King excoriated the US government for its immoral, tragic, and illogical war in Vietnam. He took to task our arrogant government, professing concerns about the freedom of foreign nations while not setting our own house in order. He wrote, quote, "We are willing to make the Negro 100% of a citizen in warfare, but reduce him to 50% of a citizen on American soil," end quote. He asserted, "The past is prophetic in that it asserts loudly that wars are poor chisels for carving our peaceful tomorrows." Not only are wars immoral, perpetuating more violence, but they also divert precious resources from the necessary task of addressing poverty and economic inequality. Dr. King saw how poverty slows and sickens any country. In 1967, his essay, Poverty and the World House, he called for a fight against world poverty, fueled by the rich nations who understand that developing the underdeveloped, schooling the unschooled, and feeding the underfed would result in stronger, more creative, and prosperous neighbors who could only benefit the entire planet. Focusing closer to home, Dr. King addressed the Union Local 1199 in New York City in March of 1968 with a speech entitled "The Other America," in which he juxtaposes two realities, two Americas, one flowing with the milk of prosperity and the honey of equality, an America of millions of young people who grow up in the sunlight of opportunity, and the other America of daily ugliness that turns buoyancy into despair. In this other America, millions of other young people are stuck in substandard, quality-less schools, graduating with barely an 8th grade reading level at best. This other America also suffers from a crushing economic inequality, what he called, quote, a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity, end quote. With inadequate wages, questionable health care, and substandard housing. His answer to the situation? He outlined a Poor People's Campaign and a march on Washington. His campaign died with him the following month. Dr. King's vision of a more morally sound and just America lives on in the work of so many others. His daughter, Dr. Bernice King, is the director of the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia, advancing her parents' work on nonviolent social change. Bishop William Barber, former president of the North Carolina NAACP, helped restart the Poor People's Campaign back in 2018 to reimagine that work for the 21st century. Reverend Barber is now the founding director of the Center of Public Theology and Public Policy at Yale Divinity School, and a number of us have been fortunate enough to hear his inspiring ideas. His aim is to empower more faith leaders to lead a moral movement, to raise the questions whose answers will move this world forward, bringing us just a few steps closer to Martin's promised land. Thus ends my homily for the day. So may it be. Amen.